sit down here and grab a microphone. There we go. Should be good. Should we just give them a thumbnail about what dark rides are all about, where they came from? Is it?
There's probably some big fans in here, but even if you were like a fan of dark rides, you know that it's a complicated definition. Like you say to someone who is not really an amusement park person, like, oh, I'm interested in dark rides, or I love dark rides, or something like that, and they'd be like, what? So, you know, but we're talking about, you know, haunted houses, ghost trains, car-based rides at amusement parks. Should I get straight into talking about the context of why?
Well, sure. Let's. I mean, let's just say where they came from a little bit. There was a ride in some of the early amusement parks called the Dark Mill, the Old Mill, excuse me, and it was a water ride. You get into a boat and float along through these canals and inside of a building, and the scenery was all like caverns and devils and monsters and ghouls, and it was meant to sort of terrify you. And it was fun for one, but more fun for two, because there's nothing more erotic than the chill of fear, and that was what it was all about. And if you're wondering what these, and there's only a couple of them left of these old mill rides in some of the older amusement parks, if you're wondering what the equivalent is, in today's world it would be, It's a Small World, except that is far more terrifying than any of them, because those kids are just creepy. There's just no two ways about it. They're terrifying. And so that was a staple, but the problem was a number of the small amusement parks didn't have room for one of these big rides because they took up quite a bit of real estate. So in the 1920s, a man by the name of Leon Cassidy, who had a small amusement park in New Jersey, came up with an innovation. He created a track that kind of doubled back on itself, an electrified track, and used first Dodgem or bumper cars that you would get in and ride through this thing. And like I say, it would kind of turn you around and double back so they could cover more territory in less space. And he had a contest as to what to call the ride, and someone said the Firefly, but they didn't quite like that because there's a wooden building with sparks coming out from the thing. That just is inviting disaster and irony. So someone said they felt like a pretzel the way they were turned around, and so it became known as the Pretzel, and this was the Pretzel Ride Company. And then it was quite an innovation. It became very popular. There were a number of imitators. The most well-known was the Laugh in the Dark ride. And in 1930, he took a mobile version of this up to Canada, to the Canadian National Exposition, and that kind of gave carnival owners the idea that maybe they could take this on the road with them. And it basically blossomed until, well, probably right after World War II. There were some innovations and stuff, but the heyday was probably the 1930s, would you say?
Yeah, it's a fascinating history, dark rides. It's not really covered enough. You can read like enthusiasts' blogs, but there's not a clear history. And I mean, I'm trying to plot. That's what led me to this project, was trying to plot out a real history of the dark ride, because unlike a roller coaster or a Ferris wheel or a carousel, it's a mediated experience. It's like a computer game. Someone has to design it and lead you through this story. And because of that, everyone is slightly different. And also because of that, it's very hard to capture. So the history of each of these rides is really important to the place that they were built. And that's something that sort of occurred to me. But what you'll notice is throughout history, there have been boom times for the dark ride. And at first, like Todd was saying, in the 20s and even the 10s, people started building them because they were simply a cheaper way to entertain people than running a whole bowling alley or a dance hall. I mean,
or a live show with performers.
Exactly. Yeah, you could take a room like this, and instead of having to run an event, or get a band, you could simply run one of these tracks through it and just gradually build up a little bit of a like a haunted garden type thing, an indoor kind of space. And people did and just added to it. So they were really localised. And what I've learned, I'm an Australian, and the culture, I guess we'll get to that.
Yeah.
But the culture in America of setting up your own haunts is really strong, and it's existed for past the last century. So this became an automated way to do that. And I thought, well, that, that's really worth recording. But there's two sides. Todd was talking about the old mill ride and the sexy times, the romance of it. The earliest type of dark ride is probably the tunnel of love. It's not supposed to be scary, but being alone in a dark place with your partner, if you're a teenager, is kind of scary. So there's always this connection to love and to privacy, especially in the time before the motor car. So those beautiful old flamingo rides, are an early example of a dark ride. Just a chance to be away from your parents for a couple of minutes.
And that's all it takes.
Spookorama, for example, that you can go and see in Coney Island, at Dino's one.
Yeah, Dino's one.
This is an example of the dual nature of a dark ride, how interesting they are both as a media device and as a kind of history, romantic kind of nostalgic thing. The ride is really tall. It's built in the 30s, and if you imagine, it's like you're in a giant cup, and the front of the cup is cut out, and the cup spins, and well, it used to spin. It used to sort of move you backwards and forwards to view the different parts of the ride. And so originally, it would rotate on the track, and you can actually see the old schematic of how it ran. But that ride was designed before cameras in movies pivoted. Right, so you can see it as an early example of a moving point of view, because cameras had to stay still, or at the very least move sort of horizontally along a kind of dolly. So that track system is a way of thinking about editing, and I went there with my brother and he said, "Oh, that's one of the worst things I've ever been on. What the hell's that?" And I said, "No, it's fascinating. It's not the worst thing you've ever seen." If you think about it, what you've got is a room with a bunch of props and a track. There's no walls. At Spookorama, there's no walls, there's no architecture, there's no building. It's a classic dark ride. All of the editing comes from this track and the way that the cart moves left and right. And if you think about this cup that you're in, it frames your vision just like that. You can't see left or right. You just get pointed to what the vision is that the director wants you to see. And if you think about it, it's exactly like cropping a film. It's a perfect aesthetic kind of window to look through at the world. But it's also a great place to make out with someone and no one else can see.
When did you see Spookorama the first time?
2006.
2006. So that was pre-Hurricane Sandy, and it was pretty ragged at that time. And one of my favorite things about the old Spookorama is that the displays would break down, and they wouldn't fix them, or they just rip them all out. And there was one point, and I don't know if it was there in 2006, that made me laugh out loud. And that you're going around, and it's paper mache figures, and the light comes up, and it wobbles and stuff. And at one point, obviously, there had been something there, but had broken or fallen apart or something, and they took it out, and there was just a broom. The light came up, and there was just a broom that they used to sweep out the place. And it's a broom. That's all it was. It's going to do something. No, it's just a broom. And that was my favorite part of it. But now, unfortunately, because of Hurricane Sandy and it being at the seashore there, and was low, it was flooded, and all those original ones have been taken out. And I think there's like one or two of them still left. And they've been replaced with sort of the modern pneumatic jump out at you, things you find in many of the haunts, the permanent haunts. Which is, it loses some of its charm, but it's still kind of great to be on that ride.
Yeah, we went to a ride last year that we haven't filmed yet, but we were shooting a documentary which led to this project. And we went to Lake Winnie, and it's actually in Georgia, but it's on the Tennessee border. Lake Winnipesaukee, and they had one of these classic old rides, and I mean they really felt like they had to update it, but they also needed to change it because they had a second level that had no fire escapes. And they said if they could just move the park a couple of miles to Tennessee, they'd be fine, no one would care, but in Georgia they did care. So I said that's good, I mean, I'm glad you're not. Anyway, they redid it, and they kind of gave it a kind of wacky theme, and whatever. It's really not its original. But they let us in the roof, and they stored all the old props, and it was amazing. So there was no light. We had to sort of shine our phones, Blair Witch style, and we get to look at all these barrels and cages and skulls and all this sort of stuff. And I thought, geez, it is getting to that point that, you know, there, enthusiasts might be the biggest crowd that want to go on ghost trains, but I mean, you could run this as a ride, you know, it'd be popular.
Before we go any further, let's just get into the nuts and bolts. What made you wake up one day and say, I got to do this? I have to chronicle dark rides using 360 virtual reality imaging technology.
We've discussed all of the kind of the emotional point, the reasons, I think. So I have been studying dark rides for about 10, 12 years as part of my academic study, university study. The key point that I was interested in is, you know, is this important for cinema? Is this important for contemporary media? Is this an important thing, dark rides, for people who are making computer games? It is. And I've been consistently writing about that. You know, you can look at actually the best thing you can find about old dark rides is the most solid piece of historical data is actually the patents. So you can go and get the patent for the pretzel ride. It's on Google, and it's just, I mean, it's beautiful. It's a drawing, but it's lovely parchment with all the notes of where all the little circuits trigger stuff off. And anyway, it's online. It's beautiful. So that was the study. But I started coming back from Melbourne to the United States often to kind of see as many of these rides, write about them, and photograph them. And you would, if you were an enthusiast, you sort of, you know, you have a list, or you go to the various sort of websites like Laugh in the Dark or things like that. And you sort of look at these lists and you go, I go to that one, I go to that one. But I started noticing, you know, the second paragraph on every one of these reviews was, and sadly it's shut, or and sadly it's no longer with us, and sadly. And then I went to the Spook House in Keansburg, New Jersey, which is a beautiful, kooky little place, and there was no one there. And the ride is just this beautiful little 1930s pretzel ride. And then I saw that was destroyed by Hurricane Sandy. And every year these parks close, or they get a disaster happens, and there's no money. There's not enough people going through the door to fund any kind of rehab. And the Spook House in Keansburg is classic. You can find thousands of people online who really want to get it up and running, but the cost is just extreme. And that was one that I'd been to, and I thought, I can't remember it all. I can't kind of figure out just how excellent it was. And people shoot videos of them, and it's great, but you don't get a sense of the sound. You don't get a sense of the movement, the pace, because people are just naturally moving their camera. So I thought, I've got to do something. Really, there's so few that sadly, it's an easy project. Sadly, there's only about 14.
Well, when you start off a project like this, you have some expectations of what you're going to encounter. And how has this quest been in terms of what you expected and what was unexpected?
Parks are really hard to get in touch with. They're hard to contact. They're hard to knuckle down, to nail down. So I actually got on a plane with only 2 of the rides, kind of making direct contact with me. The minute you get there and you explain what you're doing, certainly the parks that I went to, you uncover this whole kind of backstory, this sense of a culture behind the ride. What one are we looking at there? Just seeing it's at Trimper's rides in Ocean City, Maryland. You know, you meet Stephanie Trimper. Her grandfather built the ride. He went down the road, bought a ride that was built in the 30s, installed it into the building, and he and this other guy, whose granddaughter I met later that day, they built the ride together. Then I meet, I want to say Gary, but I met the guy who's the technician who runs the ride, and his son is there with him, who's learning how to run the ride, maintain it. He takes you through bit by bit all the parts, where they came from, and what he did and what he built to kind of restore them, add to them, and get them working. And consistently, and these are people who haven't been able to travel to many of the other amusement parks at all, nor have they getting very long holidays. But consistently, they're aware of the history, they're aware of the importance of the rides to people. And each prop, you know, he could easily say, you know, I'm really into Dracula, so we tore it all out and we did Dracula. They're really, really sacred places to these people. And so that's something that I want to continue to kind of capture, along with the 3D, to get sort of, this is the haunted house, this is Trimper's Ride. It's probably the most iconic of all the spaces. Yeah. So that backstory, I guess I hoped it was there, and I knew that people would care about them, but it was, you know, it was so solid.
How many rides have you been able to chronicle this way, and how many are on your list? You said about 14, but what have you done? What's coming up?
So we've done 5 in the United States. So it started at Luna Park in Melbourne, which is a 1934 ghost train ride, and I started there because I live there, and they let me test the whole system out, and they see the importance because they're so far away from this haunt culture that really is based in the US. They see the importance of connecting with that and showing that their ride is important. So I started there, and then because I travelled in the north, I travelled in Pennsylvania and New York State a lot, I started in the south. And I visited a guy in Alabama who rebuilt a ride from Panama City Beach. And he rebuilt it from scratch. And we started with him because we'd been making a documentary about this guy. And from there we went to Camden Park in Huntington, West Virginia, and two on the East Coast in Delaware and Maryland. So we did those 4 spaces in the US. There are, I think, something like 7 more sites to go to. And I guess phase 1 was the reason that was phase 1 is because those are the places that I wanted to go, that I'd never been. So now that we're done, we're trying to kind of, I guess, move into stage 2 and go back to some of the rides that I'm more aware of, like Spookorama in New York, and capture them.
You mentioned that seeing that room in the Georgia-Tennessee border place, and that was quite a surprise. Did anything really unexpected happen? Any strange and twisted things happen to you while doing this stuff?
No, look, nothing spooky. You know, you go to the bottom of the base of the Appalachian Mountains and you think something could happen. You tell people in Australia you're going to hang out in Alabama for a week with a guy and his homemade ride, and what is basically...
And they expect to never see you again, is that...
That's exactly what they say. We're very prejudiced people, Australians. So ignorant, prejudiced people. But, you know, it's really surprising. You go to these places, you go to, like Camden Park, you know, Huntington, West Virginia is a pretty quiet town. It's the capital, I think, of West Virginia. But that is in the middle of nowhere, by quoting the people of the town. You get to the park and you're like, this is a bit spooky, a bit scary, but the minute you get there, you're just so comfortable. It's actually, there's only that sort of carnival type stuff that you imagine in your head that might be a bit weird. It's sort of gone. I was always amazed how comfortable and sort of stuff. You see this ride, it looked like a death trap, but the guy running it's like, yeah, it's just, I love it. You know, everybody's full of joy and they're running these sort of creepy rides. That's a fantastic ride, actually. It's not the best footage. We're probably on it in a minute now, but it's a self-propelled ride. So a chain just pulls you up two stories of a haunted castle and drops you. So it's like you're riding a bathtub down a slide or something. It's out of control. There's something holding you on, but that was great.
I would imagine that the owners, day in and day out, dealing with the public. I mean, everyone that runs a haunt has lots of stories. I would imagine that they've had a few things happen through the years. Any stories that came forth?
Yeah, the people at Trippers would talk of, you know, Ocean City's a party town, and they say they struggle to...
You noticed that, huh?
I did notice that.
Yeah.
Second-hand and first-hand. They really... It's not a kooky story. It's actually a sad story. You know, I met with the woman there who runs the park, and you know, she looked forlorn. I think because for the first time she'd actually get to talk about this ride that she spends all this time trying to maintain and get people to go on. And she's like, you know, no one's going on it. She goes, every couple of weeks we get like a tour group come here from like you guys, like who love haunts. And she goes, in between, we struggle to stop people urinating in the place. And it's not a funny story. It was really sad, you know. But, you know, I'm surprised how little spookiness there is around these rides. They're honest to goodness old fun. You know, you know, looking at the archival project and thinking about just how, you know, people say, why is it important to do this? And someone came up to me yesterday and said, it's a bit like pinball. you know, pinball machines. Like they're not around so much anymore. You'll never be able to share that experience with someone, you know, what it might be like to ride on. But it's an absolutely wholesome kind of thing. But in a sense, I emailed the Smithsonian and said, hey, would you guys be interested in this project? It's, you know, it's nostalgia, it's Americana, it's definitely a piece of history. And they were like, oh yeah, you know, how sad, that's a great story. No, we only deal with the raw data, photographs, you know, of stuff. And I said, these are photographs of the stuff, it's going to go. And I mean, there's this sort of snobbery about popular entertainment, computer games, pinball, ghost trains, that sort of makes people feel like, oh, we'll reminisce about them when they're gone. You know, we won't bother kind of archiving them. We'll wait till they're... We'll wait till we have to go and search out black and white photographs of them, and then we can all have a bit of a cry. But I think we need to kind of cut to the chase and actually do something about this.
You kind of mentioned in one little sentence, one sad sentence, but what do you think is the future of dark rides, the independent dark rides?
Well, I mean, look, I think what's going on with haunts, and if you haven't, you know, go check out, you know, John Schnitzer's movie Haunters. That's the future, and you guys are the future of this sort of homemade, engaging community stuff. So I think there's a great resurgence in interest, but I think the time is now to connect what haunters are doing, people who build their own haunts, which is something that's really new to me. As an Australian, we just don't do that. And we need to, right now, just say, where did this come from? What's the history of this? And the history is these cart-based rides. There's something that we need to record. And so I think that the future is great. There's great haunted house rides, there's great kind of digital spooky sort of stuff. You know, Eli Roth, if he's building it, even if it went out of business, but the point is, people are building this stuff, so people love it. But we just need, it's really to spend a minute and solidify what we've got from history.
You mentioned America, but there's this also, dark rides are kind of prevalent all around the world. Ghost Train, you mentioned, is in Blackpool.
Yep.
It's still going.
The River Caves. The River Caves is the second oldest dark ride in the world. Kennywood, that we were talking about earlier. So Kennywood in Pittsburgh has an old mill, which is now Garfield's nightmare. But I'm not worried about that. It's still an old mill, and until they turn it into a Garfield's head, it's still the old mill. And there's a big campaign to turn it back into the old mill. So if you haven't been there, Kennywood's a beautiful park on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. It's atypical of an old trolley park.
You see nods and smiles about people who've been to Kennywood, yeah.
And it's great. And Blackpool was built around the same time. And these were parks that were built on the influence of Coney Island and Luna Park at Coney Island. And that Blackpool is in the north of England. It's the hub of the Industrial Revolution. It was the first time people ever went on holiday. They were given a couple of weeks off, and they would catch the train to Blackpool. And they built a similar to the old mill. They called it the River Caves, and you kind of float on a log through this journey. Interestingly, in England, because they're not quite so interested in heaven and hell, their early rides were all about just travel to exotic lands. It says heaps about the different countries. You know, the British are really interested in exploring their many nations they conquered. So you'd go on a sort of slightly scary ride to Cambodia or India or you know, the other parts of the world that they had colonies. You know, but of course no one from the industrial north of England was going to go to Cambodia in 1901, but they were really interested in travel. For the first time, they were mobilised through a growing sort of middle class or working class to travel, and they wanted to do more of it. And the only thing they could really do was ride a ride. And that is where I believe the kind of concept or the scope behind It's a Small World After All would have come from. Highly ideological, right? Really about, you know, politics and people and aspiration. Different dark rides to your normal spooky descent into hell, which obviously they connect with a whole lot of stuff that people feel. So, but anyway, so yeah, Blackpool, Germany have a rich history, and they have two rides from the 30s, and they have obviously a whole history of cabaret and carnival that's rich.
Among other history.
among other history. Yeah, they stopped making rides after the 40s.
Yeah.
They
were going on a dark ride of a different kind.
Yeah. This took a few years. But they have that spooky past as well. But I mean, fairy tales are German just ghost. Anyway, ghost trains. It sounds really good in German. I just don't know what it is. But anyway, Google it. So yeah, Germany. There's a beautiful ride in Stockholm, which is similar to Melbourne. It's very old, but it's been maintained beautifully. The Scandinavian countries, they're similar to Melbourne in a way. They're quite affluent, and they maintain things and obsessively keep all their heritage sort of polished. So they have a beautiful old ride from the 30s that I've never been to. But, I guess we're looking at this stage. We're looking for some support to move the project further.
I want to get into that. I want to talk about the future of the project, and we brought up that Disney ride, and there's a little bit of trivia. It's a great story, and I like stories. And it's a lovely story in that Walt Disney had conceived doing this ride for the New York World's Fair. And he thought it was appropriate at World's Fair, to kind of revive the old mill idea, and it was about children around the world. And he contacted the Sherman Brothers, who were the composers. They did work on Jungle Book and Mary Poppins, of course. And he contacted them and said, "Hey, Robert and Dick, I have this idea for a ride." They said, "We have a song for it." So, well, let me tell you what the ride is. He said, "No, we have a song. We've got the song. Perfect for what you're doing, Walt." I said, "Well, you haven't even heard it." He said, No, we have the song. We want you to use it." What? Well, let me explain. And he explained what the ride is. He said, "Yes, we've got the perfect song. It's great." And what had happened is, I think it was Robert Sherman had come up with the melody, and it was literally driving him insane. He couldn't get it out of his head. So when Walt called, he knew that the way to get rid of it was to unleash it on the world. So when Walt called and said, "I have this project," he said, "Here, take this song." And that's the "It's a Small World" song that was, driving me crazy and evil. It is probably one of the great evils of all time. And that's why.
Everybody.
So now that I bring that up, you can't really talk about dark rides and without talking about the Disneyland.
There's in Alabama, just outside of Birmingham, there's a guy named Tim Hollis, and if you Google him, he's the most fascinating guy. And he has these amazing bottle-rimmed glasses. And he wrote a book about one of the amusement parks that I went to. So we visited him, and he said, "Oh, you can come and have a look at some of my collection." He said, "Okay, cool." I mean, the guy is like he's fascinating, just really sweet, but he's a sort of archetypical nerdy-looking guy. And he knows everything about Americana and about Disney and about roadside attractions, and you name it, if it's a collectible. And he says, "Just come into my room in the back of my house." He has a 2-story museum in his house that I found out about afterwards. After we visited him, and then he showed us this museum. He has a museum in his house. And if you look him up, he's written about 8 books, and one of them is, one's called Dixie Before Disney. So he's actually sort of studied, the sort of rides and culture before Disney changed the way that we think about amusement parks and destinations and things like that. I love Disneyland. It's very hard when it's not, look, it's good to have a job, but it's still very expensive to come to America. So I normally come alone. I don't bring my partners. It's very hard to sort of ride the Mickey Mouse ride, the Snow White ride on your own. You sort of get feels.
You have to rent a child. It's basically what it is.
Yeah. So, "Hey, would you mind coming on?" It's sort of awkward. But there's this progression of super famous parks. You talked about Luna Park. If you're talking about the history of the dark ride,